This is a Power 98.7 podcast. Now we're talking. Subscribe to Power 98.7 podcasts in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. There's more on power987.co.za.
Piet Rampedi, investigative journalist and deputy editor of the Sunday Independent, as I said earlier on, joins us on the line. Piet, good evening to you. How are you?
Good evening, Thabiso, and good evening to the listeners of Power Perspectives. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for your time. First and foremost, I want to start with a general question. You are a journalist. You've been at it for quite a while, but there is some kind of for lack of a better word, I suppose, not finding each other with other journalists in particularly in the newspaper space, even in the broadcasting space as well. Don't you feel somehow isolated? Or how would you describe it to some people who see this battle, this back and forth battle between you and some of the well-known journalists? What's the perspective there?
Look, Thabiso, contrary to what some people may think, I don't feel isolated. In fact, I'm in a good space because I find everything wrong with how some of my colleagues have been behaving and how they've been seemingly showing very little regard for the facts and how they have not been showing commitment to the truth. And I will tell you what I mean, Thabiso, because if you look at some of these journalists with whom I appear to be fighting, some of them are actually people that I've worked with previously, closely, across various newsrooms. You would know that I've worked for almost all the big media houses and newspapers. I've worked for City Press, I've worked for Sunday Times, I've worked for Sunday Independent. This is my second stint. I've worked for The Star, I've worked for SABC, I've worked for ENC, ETV at the time. So these are not people that I have not worked closely with. Some of them, have been my close colleagues, but we are not necessarily having personal problems. We just have professional differences because sometimes they don't seem to be interested in the facts and they don't seem to be flexible and to be chasing the truth. They seem to be married to certain narratives. They seem to be too loyal to certain politicians and to certain actors in society, which for me is a bit of a problem because as journalists, we need to be committed to the facts. We need to be loyal to the truth. And if and when the facts change, and so should our positions, we cannot stick to narratives simply because we think that's where our loyalty lies.
Yeah. So people, I generally get calls from people who say, you the media, a type of a thing. Sometimes it's a bit frustrating because everybody is painted with the same brush. But, are you saying to us that people that consume our work really have a point when they point towards the media?
Look, I think to a larger extent, Thabiso, they do have a point. Where I don't agree with them is when they generalize, because sometimes I get a sense that they think we are one homogeneous group of people and that we work for the same media house or we have the same editor-in-chief or we report to the same people. And I often say to them, look, we're actually different people who work for different media houses, owned by different people, edited by different people. Yes, you do have some of the journalists and editors who are friends. They belong to the same clique. But the reality of the matter is that even though in some instances they do influence each other or approach the stories in a uniform manner, the reality of the matter is that it's just a small clique. The majority of the journalists are operating independently. It's just a group of people who are prominent journalists who then decided to form these informal clubs where they seem to influence each other. But to a larger extent, the majority of journalists are actually hardworking and they're independent. They may not be vocal on social media, which then creates an impression that those who are making noise there are actually the only journalists and they're the people who matter in society in as far as journalism is concerned. But the reality of the matter is that the majority of journalists are independent. The majority of journalists are actually hardworking and they are committed to the truth. However, they are not as prominent as this clique which seems to be dominating the streets.
Let's also get clarity on the issue of the rogue unit as well, because, even some of us at some point got a bit confused because you broke the story about the rogue unit and then there was this pushback as well. And some of these prominent journalists were also accusing you of having peddled fake news, and this ping pong battle continued. And then, boom, yesterday during the appearance of Pravin Gordhan, one got a sense that indeed the rogue unit existed, even though he insists that it existed, but existed for legal purposes or as a legal entity, and it had to be done because of the importance of tax collection and all of that. Please give us a perspective, Piet, as to some people who are confused about it because there's a Skakani report. Some people are saying that it has been done away with, but some people are saying no, it's still active, and so on and so forth. If you can just take time and give us a perspective there.
Okay. So with your permission, let me just make one final point regarding what is happening in the industry and why I'm saying there's a clique of journalists who do not seem to be committed to the truth.
Yeah.
If you look at what has been happening since last year or since 2018, there's been a lot of commissions set up by the government to investigate various sectors of governance, whether it's the PIC, whether it's the Zondo Commission, or whether it's the Mohoro Commission into the NPA, and whether you talk about many other commissions. If you look at how the majority of the journalists that I am talking about, or with whom I seem to be fighting, whenever they covered the Zondo Commission, whenever they covered the Nugent Commission into SARS, the Mohoro Commission into the NPA, as well as the PIC, the Mpati Commission into the PIC, if you follow how they covered those four key commissions, or you can, anybody can actually do a desktop research, their approach seemingly was so similar to a point that it raised a lot of suspicions. And I'll tell you what I mean by this. Where they accepted the versions of certain witnesses, or the versions of certain witnesses as evidence, all of them accepted that evidence as gospel truth. And where they rejected counter evidence from some people as gossip, for example, almost all of them treated that evidence with disdain. And where they treated certain witnesses as angels, all of them accepted the evidence from those witnesses as nothing but truth. Where they treated evidence from people that they regarded as villains, they rejected almost exclusively, almost entirely, such evidence as false or dubious, regardless of what would have been presented before the commission. But their approach was that certain people were correct, or certain people were angels, or certain people were actually fighting against corruption, and then others were defending corruption or were part of the so-called fight back, or they were actually guilty of state capture. So their approach has not been helpful, because these are the people who are supposedly competing as members of various media houses, but the end product is almost the same, as if they report to the same editor-in-chief or they work for the same media houses. But that be as it may, let me come back to the issue of the rogue unit.
Yeah.
The issue of the rogue unit, Thabiso, started in 2014 when I was part of the Sunday Times investigative unit alongside Mzilikazi Wafri and Stefan Hofstadter. We broke that story and exposed the existence of this illegal intelligence unit within SARS, whose members were operating from home, whose members were following people around, invading people's privacies. In some instances, we got evidence that they've been given high-level, technical equipment to conduct illegal surveillance, and that they would actually hide behind some high walls and binoculars, look at whatever would have been happening inside the offices or the private premises of certain people that they suspected of tax evasion, and that in some instances they actually bugged the offices of the National Prosecuting Authority in the run-up to the 2007 elective conference of the ANC on behalf of certain factions in the ANC. We also heard that at some point they actually conducted illegal surveillance on prominent politicians at the time, including Julius Malema, who was the president of the ANC Youth League at the time. They also apparently conducted illegal surveillance on people like Tokyo Sohwale and many other people who were part of the Zuma camp in the run-up to the Polokwane conference. So we wrote all of those stories at the time, but in response, SARS then asked a lawyer called Ganyani to conduct an investigation into the report, which we had published at the time. The Ganyani report was released, and it said that indeed what was happening at SARS was wrong, and that there was a rogue unit which existed. At the time, SARS was led by Ivan Pillay as the acting deputy commissioner. Pillay then and his executive decided to commission another report. This time they hired advocate Moses Kakani, who was assisted by about 6 or 7 other lawyers. They conducted an investigation into our stories and interviewed senior management at SARS, some of the sources, current and ex-employees of SARS, went through all the records of SARS, and they concluded in their report that indeed the rogue unit existed, and that it was unlawful, it was illegal, and that it had conducted itself in an unlawful manner. So what happened then was that Tom Moyane was then appointed as SARS commissioner, permanent commissioner, to replace the Obama who had resigned. Yeah. So when Tom Moyane took over, he found that this Kakane report was on the table and it had all its findings. What Tom Moyane then did, because from what we later heard, there were discussions within the senior management team of SARS at the time, and then when he wanted to implement the recommendations of the Kakane report, some of the implicated parties, Ivan Pillay, Johan van Locherenberg, as well as Adrian Lakay, then resigned or were asked to leave. I don't remember what the case was, but they left. Either they were forced out or they resigned. Then the new management of SARS under Tom Moyane decided to ask a panel of tax experts to conduct their own investigation, just to see whether there would be different findings this time around. That panel of experts, of tax experts, was then led by retired Judge Zondo. They conducted their own investigation. This time it was not just lawyers. It was tax experts in the main and a couple of lawyers. It was a team of about 11 people. They conducted their investigation, their report came, and they said, no, we concur with the findings of this Kotane report, and we think this rogue unit was illegal. How it was formed was illegal because SARS does not have the mandate to conduct intelligence operations. That mandate rests with the National Intelligence Agency, and now, which is now called State Security Agency. They released that report, and then when it was time to implement the findings, they then said, okay, let's get final opinion, perhaps from the market this time around. That's when they asked the commissioned KPMG to conduct their own investigation from a forensic point of view. Remember, now they've got a report from a legal point of view. They've got a report from a tax point of view. Now they wanted a report from a forensic point of view. KPMG came with their report, and they said, no, this rogue unit was illegal. It was not supposed to have been established, and as a result, we concur that heads must roll, and whoever was responsible must face the music. That's what happened. That's when Tom Moyane laid criminal charges as per the recommendations of the Kotane report, the Zondo report, and the Ganyane report and KPMG. He then laid the charges against some of the people who were in management at the time, excluding former Commissioner Pravin Gordhan, who's now the Minister of Public Enterprises.
Yeah. So this argument that says it existed, but it existed to do things that were legally acceptable as per the argument of Pravin Gordhan yesterday flies out of the window, because it is something that falls under the purview of the National Intelligence Agency, as was argued by Dali Mpofu, right?
Look, it flies off the window for two reasons, Thabiso. Even before we revisit the argument or the proceedings of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry yesterday, most of the journalists who today are saying the unit's existence was never in question, what was in question was its mandate or its legality. For a long time, we're actually denying that unit existed. It was only halfway through when it was proven beyond reasonable doubt that there was such a unit, where they said, the unit is there, but it's actually called a high-risk unit whose mandate was not to conduct surveillance. Even when a list of equipment was released, when I was at Sunday Times, we wrote stories giving a list of the equipment which was confiscated, giving a list of equipment which was found in the documents belonging to members of that unit, citing testimony from some of the members of the unit. We even wrote a story based on an affidavit released by one of the unit members who had confessed to having taken part in that operation. His name, I think, was Elhard Lombard. He confirmed that we did 1, 2, and 3. We followed people around. We visited a lot of places where we conducted surveillance. We placed some people under illegal surveillance. So it was beyond reasonable doubt. It was only at that point when most of the people who were saying, in fact, most of the journalists who were saying the unit existed, but it was legal. It was at that point where they said, it actually existed, but it was not necessarily illegal. But secondly, when you look at the legal mandate and the law, even if it existed, the fact that it conducted intelligence operations and it placed people under surveillance, which is beyond the mandate of SARS. Because in terms of the current laws, only the National Intelligence Agency, which is SSA now, crime intelligence, which falls within the police, military intelligence, which falls within the Department of Defense, can conduct intelligence operations or surveillance or any other entity approved by the president. In this case, SARS was not approved by the president. What happened was that when the unit was conceptualized in 2007, the leadership of SARS under Pravin Gordhan at the time wrote a letter, as it was required, to the then National Intelligence Agency, saying that we are facing a very serious problem of tax evasion, illegal poaching, illegal cigarette smuggling, and things like those. We feel that these criminals are so sophisticated. We need some form of capacity which can actually counter them. Mm-hmm. So we are proposing that we fund an intelligence operative, which will then service our needs in that regard. We will then give you the budget, but because the mandate rests with state security, you will do the job and then give us the report. That was what the letter said to NIA. However,
I'm sorry, I'm going to push you there, Piet, because we are left with 6 minutes, because there's one or two key questions that I also want to pose. So obviously, this unit, according to the testimony, was not supposed to exist, was not supposed to be formed by SARS because it was not in their purview and it was illegal. Then what happens?
Look, when they were not happy with the then mayor's response or reluctance to actually run that unit on their behalf, they then wrote a memo to the former finance minister, Trevor Manuel, at the time, requesting budget and permission and approval. Trevor Manuel then rejected their request and said he could not approve of that. They left it there and created an impression that the matter, had actually rested. They were done with it. Then they turned around and established precisely the same unit with the same mandate and as envisaged in their letter to NIA. However, because they knew it was illegal, they then operated it outside the premises of SARS. Members of that unit, who were about 30 or 35, operated from their own private homes. They held meetings in the restaurants. They were issued with access cards, but bearing false names, some of them, and they were paid from a different cost code, which did not reflect them as employees of SARS. However, the budget came from SARS, although it was redirected through a different code as if they were performing some other jobs. What they would then do in terms of our investigations at the time, whenever they conducted their work, they would write reports, hand the reports over to, at first, a guy called Skoli, who was the unit founding manager. When he resigned, he was then replaced by Johan van Logerenbeck, who then managed the unit. They would hand over the reports to him. They would then process the reports, hand them over to Ivan Pillay. They'll then see what they want to do. But because the reports had been compiled through illegal means, they wouldn't use them openly in a court of law, but they would then use the information for whatever purpose that they wanted to achieve.
So what should happen to Pravin is a big question.
Look, at this point in time, I think his admission was so profound because it was for the first time under oath where he admitted that the rogue unit existed and that it was illegal. If you watched all the proceedings, you'll realize that he was extremely reluctant to actually tackle that question because it has got serious implications for him. He couldn't lie under oath and said it did not exist. He couldn't lie under oath and said it was legal. And equally, he couldn't dismiss the issue because keeping quiet would still have had a negative impact on his image, because if something happened and it was within the law, why would we have a problem dealing with that issue? But at the same time, you must also check how his own lawyer tried to protest and prevent that question from being posed. Check how the evidence leader tried to protect him as well, because a lot of things were at stake. It was always going to impugn his professional integrity, because this has been a thorn for a long time, and it was a topic which he had said that was fake news, and he was also at the center of the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture. So for him to appear there and fail to produce evidence, first, that Moyane conspired with the Hawks, secondly, that Zuma was a part of state capture, and thirdly, that a lot of people he had mentioned as the enablers of state capture were actually guilty of such. For him to fail to produce any tangible evidence was just bad for him. But we'll see what happens, because we're still going to have a lot of people appearing before the State Capture Commission of Inquiry.
I was asking that question deliberately because this is a figure whom we are told is an untouchable, so to speak.
Look, I think a lot of it is going to depend on what happens within the ANC or at the level of the ANC, because dealing with him or making him to account, I don't see it as entirely something that will happen at the level of government or state capture. I think, if anything, it will happen at the level of the ANC, starting with this week's NEC, where I think some of his detractors may want to debate that issue and reflect on it. And in the run-up to the NGC, you may have some of the people asking uncomfortable questions, also heading to the next ANC conference. I think whether anything happens to him will depend on the dynamics, the political dynamics within the ANC, the power play and the balance of forces within the NEC currently, whether or not President Cyril Ramaphosa's supporters are still dominating the NEC, or whether or not there's a shift based on whatever developments are happening. You also recall that there's also the issue of the motion of no confidence against the president, which is going to take place on Thursday. So I think whether anything happens to him will depend on all these other factors that are playing themselves out within the ANC or at the level of ANC politics, as opposed to the State Capture Commission or the level of government.
I wish we had more time. Piet, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it, as always.
Thanks so much, Thabiso, and thanks for having me, and thanks to the listeners of Power Perspective.
Thank you so much, Piet Rampedi, investigative journalist and deputy editor of the Sunday Independent.
You've been listening to a Power 98.7 podcast. For more podcasts, visit power987.co.za or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.